let me just explain what these sanctions are. Never has a tool this strong, this harsh, this punitive, and this hostile been used against Israel. And it shows you how far the Biden administration is willing to go. They're willing to undermine the constitutional rights of American citizens.
International law has become perhaps one of the most central challenges facing Israel, not in the sense of an actual law, but in the sense of the use of terminology of law or international law by Israel's strategic foes as a means to try to criminalize the Jewish state, delegitimize the Jewish state, and advance the cause of political warfare against Israel. And we see it playing out almost everywhere, whether it's in the daily counterterror operations that take place in Judea and Samaria or in the war in Gaza. Anywhere you look, you see that Israel is being falsely accused of war crimes and other issues under what they claim is the international law. We see it at the UN every day and other places. Today, the International Criminal Court, their chief prosecutor is trying to issue arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gallant. You have the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, that's pursuing a genocide case against Israel, and it's huge. So we also have another issue, which is sanctions against Israeli citizens for things that aren't crimes. Anyway, we've talked about all of these issues many times on the Caroline Glick Show, and I wanted to reintroduce it today because of the continued importance of this issue and because the U.S. just decided to sanction more Israelis last week. So I called up my very old friend and colleague, Professor Eugene Kontorovich from the Kohelet Policy Forum and George Mason University's Scalia School of Law. So first of all, Professor Kontorovich, thanks so much for being on the show, Eugene, my friend.
Carolyn, great to be here.
Great. And I just want to, I will have his whole thing, I think, probably underneath your name in the show. But just to be clear, he's a professor of law at George Mason University's Scalia Law School, and he is the director of the Department of International Law at the Kohelet Policy Forum. We'll be talking about that as well. So, again, welcome to the show. And you wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal last month, I think it was, about a lawsuit that you're pursuing in representing an organization that supports Israel in Texas and an Israeli rancher from Texas here in Israel to try to challenge the U.S. sanctions against Israeli citizens and people who support Israel. So can we talk a little bit about what's going on? Why is the United States, how is the Biden administration sanctioning Israelis? What does it mean? And then let's get into your lawsuit and where these things are going.
Sure. So let me just explain what these sanctions are.
Exactly.
First of all, they're completely unprecedented. In the more than 7 decades of Israel's existence, which has gone through all sorts of rocky patches with the United States, never has a tool this strong, this harsh, this punitive, and this hostile been used against Israel. The sanctions regime is something the president has authority to issue sanctions against countries that are problematic under some laws that Congress passed, and it is typically used for terrorist states, narco states, money laundering, trafficking, and things like this. Countries that are under sanctions regimes, countries like Libya, Syria,
Iran,
North Korea, Iran, Russia for their invasion of Ukraine. There is not a single Western ally of the United States currently subject to its own special sanctions regime, and that is what President Biden announced on February 1st in the middle of Israel's war for survival. And these sanctions are a very harsh tool. They can really cripple a country because when a person is sanctioned, several things happen. But most importantly, their bank accounts, all bank accounts basically connect through in the U.S. or need access. All banks need access to the U.S. So basically the U.S. forces their banks to freeze their bank accounts.
They're Israeli citizens. They don't have any financial ties to the United States, and they're not allowed to bank in Israel.
Because all Israeli banks are connected to the United States, that's used as leverage. Their bank accounts are frozen. They cannot go on with normal life. They can't pay their bills. They can't have telephones. They can't, pay for their kids' after-school activities.
They can't pay for gas.
Anybody, and they become a legal pariah. Anybody who then interacts with them, provides them with anything, goods or services, can themselves be sanctioned.
Which is exactly what happened last week.
Which is exactly, yeah. We'll get, so their phone company will be sanctioned for giving them a cell phone. And so it is an extremely harsh measure, so it's typically reserved for really, bad men, people who have done significant mass atrocities, messed with foreign elections, acts of terror, etc. I can tell you that since February of this year, about 13 Israeli individuals have been sanctioned. Compare that to North Korea, where 8 individuals have been sanctioned, and Congo, where 1 individual has been sanctioned under other sanctions regimes. More Israelis have been sanctioned per capita than Iranians. Now let's talk about what these sanctions are for.
And by the way, we should also just add parenthetically that the Biden administration has been not enforcing and canceling their sanctions against Iranian people, so that, and the regime. So they're not enforcing the anti-Iran sanctions, and they're suddenly they've introduced this draconian program of sanctioning Israelis. So let's go into that.
Right. So exactly, this program, I just want to be clear, this fundamentally puts Israel in a different category from any other Western democracy. No other Western democracy is treated this way. Now, the rhetoric around this, the talking points, I think obscured what it really does. The rhetoric around the executive order focused on this narrative of settler violence. Right. And the State Department claims there's an epidemic of settler violence. Data from the Israeli police show that's actually the opposite of the case. In the past year, acts of vandalism, property crime, assault by Jews in Judea and Samaria has actually sharply declined. And of course, all of that is a pale shadow of the principal cause of violence in the West Bank, which is Palestinian violence. But we'll get to that disparity. The executive order is not about settler violence. That is to say, to be sanctioned, you don't need to be a settler and you don't need to be violent. And I'll give you an example.
And you don't need to have done anything illegal, in fact.
For sure don't have to have done anything illegal. You don't have to be proven to have done anything illegal. There was an organization called Tzav 9. Tzav 9 is an Israeli and civil society organization, a grassroots organization with many thousands of members. They were engaged in protest, speech activity against the delivery of aid to Gaza on the grounds that it winds up in the hands of Hamas.
Which it manifestly does.
Which the United States, by the way, State Department concedes that it does in significant part. And Hamas, of course, is a State Department designated terror organization.
So, and it's illegal to provide them with any aid under binding international law, under
binding U.S. law.
Under binding U.S. law and under binding UN Security Council Resolution, what is it, 1373?
So material support for a terrorist organization is illegal in the U.S. law, but President Biden has been pushing to provide this support, knowing that it will nonetheless wind up in the hands of Hamas. So this organization, grassroots organization of citizens, would have protests. Now, in these protests, they would block roads, obstruct traffic, as many protest movements do, as we saw, for example, the protest movement against judicial reform last year did that a lot, and the Biden administration praised that protest movement. In America, we see pro-Hamas protesters have closed Chicago Airport, San Francisco Airport, airports around New York, by blocking traffic. They are not being debanked as a result. And indeed, the activity that this group has engaged in has been described by the Biden administration as protest activity. But there's one problem. It's protest activity that the Biden administration disagrees with. And as a result, this organization has been sanctioned. And now anyone affiliated with the organization can be sanctioned. And indeed, one of its leaders, Ruth Ben Chaim, a mother of 8, does not live in the West Bank, nothing to do with the West Bank, a mother of 8 living in southern Israel, near Gaza, has had her accounts frozen and her life completely upended for protesting the delivery of aid to a terror group.
So for opposing sanctionable actions, that is, providing material support to
Criminal,
terrorist
felonious actions.
felonious sanctions that are also sanctionable. But I mean, you're right, even worse. Felonious actions. She has been denied access to the banking system.
Which effectively
money.
means to your life.
Right. I mean, you can't pay your mortgage. You get your house
Can't pay your
taken
cell
away.
phone.
You can't get
Can't run your business. Her husband, now when
can't buy gas.
when they freeze your bank accounts,
They also freeze your husband's
they
bank
freeze your
account.
entire family's accounts. Her husband is an American citizen who's also participating in this protest movement. He is one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit, which we'll get to in a second. So American citizens, for engaging in protest, are being debanked, which it's a clear violation of the First Amendment and basic due process protections. And it shows you how far the Biden administration is willing to go. They're willing to undermine the constitutional rights of American citizens themselves while professing to love free speech. For example, if you look at Biden administration and especially Kamala Harris statements about the student protest movement, they said, protest.
You mean the pro-Hamas movement?
The pro-Hamas, everyone has a right to protest. Protest is an important right. Okay, if they're violent, maybe we should do something about those individuals, but we should not tar the entire movement with
no, and she was praising their sentiments, right? Their emotions. That their emotions were understandable.
She has praised the Black Lives Matter protest movement, which had significant violent aspects. And certainly would, I think, if anyone were to try to...
She was raising money for their bail.
Yeah, if anyone were to try to debank them, she'd say that's unconstitutional. So you have manifest hypocrisy here, and not just hypocrisy and legal violations, but I think a clear inversion of values. And this is basically the use of executive power for political ends, to punish conduct, you simply speech conduct, protest conduct. John Kirby on 2 occasions described this as protest activity, which is, a First Amendment value, a free speech value. So this is extremely distressing. Other entities that have been sanctioned, so other people that have been sanctioned are people who do live in Judea and Samaria.
Like I do, for instance.
Yes, many of these people are farmers. They have farms in Judea and Samaria.
Yeah.
And
10 minutes from my house, yeah. Which is a major metropolitan center.
Yeah, in the center of Israel. And how do they get sanctioned? So there's a system. It's a clear system. They're sanctioned solely based on the accusations of clearly anti-Israel, far-left organizations. When I say clearly anti-Israel organizations, I mean one of these organizations is called Dawn Mina. It is run by Sarah Leah Winston, the former Middle East director for Human Rights Watch, and I think as clear an anti-Semite as can be. She writes reports calling for groups to be sanctioned. 4 days later, they get sanctioned. Yep. So there's a straight pipeline from anti-Israel groups to the State Department. There's also another pipeline in which these groups write reports, and then the United Nations Secretary General's office, again a clear anti-Semite, I think, collects these reports and publishes it on UN stationery, and then the U.S. says, "Oh, look, the UN said." So any allegations of violence are made against these individuals. As far as we can tell, I would love to learn otherwise, but the United States does no independent effort to verify or substantiate. For example, they don't even call these people to get their side of the story. We know that there's fundamental problems with the methodology used by the UN and these human rights groups. First of all, they rely on Palestinian self-serving accounts without verifying them. Also, and this is a common situation, they consider Jewish self-defense settler violence. So there are situations in which Jews are attacked or threatened by Palestinian groups and terrorists, mobs, sometimes rock throwers, and they engage in self-defense. If they shoot one of the rock throwers or an intruder on their farm, they're called violent settlers. That falls in the category of violent settlers in the UN's methodology, right, which the State Department cites in its own documents as relying on. And
incidentally, this is something that started very shortly after this operation, very shortly after October 7th. I remember in an early podcast after October 7th, I think it was the Gilad
Erdogan.
no, Gilad Gilad Ach's organization, that they traced the money trail, or no, it was the Kohelet, the Jewish Voice news agency, that they found that there were terrorist operatives or operatives aligned with terrorist organizations, particularly the PFLP is very active in this, and that they go and they were bothering IDF forces, reservists around Susia, and the IDF reservists, they were trying to take down guard posts and things like that. And so the guards restrained them and tried to push them back. That's when they started videoing, and they called it settler violence. And so this happened in the South Hebron Hills in the morning. They posted it. The pro-terror people posted it on their Facebook post by mid-morning or by noon. And then B'Tselem and other anti-Israel groups that have ties to the State Department were issuing statements about it in the afternoon and transferring them to the State Department. State Department officials, the State Department spokesman, was condemning settler violence by afternoon in the United States. And then the President of the United States met with the Prime Minister of Australia, and in a joint press briefing that evening, he attacked the settler violence in Israel, and you could see the entire feeding chain of how it went from the fields, how they had started this fight with the guards. The guards pushed them back. They taped it, went on their Facebook post to the president's mouth by evening time in Washington. It was unbelievable.
But one of the extraordinary things about this is some of the things that people are being sanctioned for are, even if they were true, far below the level of anything I think the United States has ever used the sanctions power for. These are things often, property crimes, or what they say intimidation. These are things you couldn't, in other words, nobody's gotten hurt. These are things that you wouldn't get arrested for in San Francisco or New York.
Yeah.
And the United States is using its sanctions power. But again, for example, last week, the security director of a community in the Shomron, Yitzhar, was sanctioned. He's an American citizen. And now he's had his bank accounts frozen. For what? He is a security director. And we have seen, just this week, by the way, how crucial local security teams are for protecting communities. We saw it on October 7th, where really the principal defense of the communities was their local security teams. Each community has one.
Would seem more saved by that.
Exactly. And just this week in Kar Mitzor, in Gush Etzion, a terrorist who came into the yeshuv with a car bomb was stopped by a member of very heroically, by a member of the local security team. So the Biden administration, it seems, is trying to deter defense by security teams. The head of the Yitzhar security team has been sanctioned for actions he took in his capacity as head of the security team in a confrontation with Palestinians that were threatening the community. And the administration says, he says it was self-defense. We don't believe it. They've never talked to him. He's a United States citizen. How can you take such aggressive action? It's worse than a fine, right? Essentially paralyze the life of a United States citizen without getting their side of the story. Is that due process? It's really quite shocking.
An ally. I mean, that's the thing. It's that Israel is an ally. It's not even just an issue of complementarity, that we have our own legal system, and if there was a law broken, that they would be investigated and charged if necessary. But we're an ally of the United States. We're engaged in a war that the United States supports, and yet they're telling us that they don't support. I mean, this is an incredible act of hostility.
That is to say, they are trusting far-left anti-Israel groups, supported often by hostile foreign countries, over the government of Israel. And the obvious effect is quite clear. If you are a member of a security team and you're in a confrontation with a Palestinian who may pose a threat to your community, now you have to calculate, is defending your community going to get your life destroyed by the United States? You're just a little guy. Is the United States State Department going to squash you to make an example? If you are, and one of the plaintiffs in this lawsuit is, as we mentioned, a farmer who from Texas, Ari Abramowitz, who has a ranch in Judea and Samaria. His family has been attacked numerous times his wife, his babies, by stone-throwing Palestinians. Now he has a calculation he has to make if he has to defend his life. Is it worth it? Am I really going to die? Or, maybe I should take a couple rocks to the head, which is better than having your life completely frozen with almost no recourse, your life turned upside down without any recourse. This is going to get people killed. It's going to get Jews killed.
So what's the lawsuit?
Okay. So these sanctions, as applied to American citizens, violate constitutional rights, and they do so in a couple ways. First of all, remember, as we mentioned, that once an entity is sanctioned, they're off limits for any kind of interactions. And there's no apparent rhyme or reason to who the administration sanctions, right? There's no need for anyone to be convicted. There's no need for anyone to even have been indicted, charged with a crime. There's no particular need for evidence. Some of these clearly may be cases of self-defense, so there's no even particular need for wrongfulness. There's no even particular need for violence, as the case of Ruth Ben Hayim shows. It could be anyone. At the same time, so violence is neither illegal violence is neither necessary nor, of course, is it sufficient, because there are hundreds, thousands of Palestinian attacks on Jews every year. The Palestinian Authority pays for this, supports it. Not a single Palestinian individual, not a single Palestinian government official has been sanctioned. So all we know is that the administration, is sort of dropping sanctions on people associated with, say, the Israeli right or Judea and Samaria. And we know they interpret this very broadly. The Treasury Department issued a warning letter. Any transactions with people who live on West Bank outposts are red flags for the Treasury Department. Now, they're not saying that everyone who lives on a West Bank outpost, farms basically, is sanctioned or is going to be sanctioned. But what they're saying, they're in line. They're under high threat of being sanctioned. So what this means is Americans who support the cause of Jews living in Judea and Samaria, who want to speak out on that, who want to engage in speech activities, who want to bring speakers from Judea and Samaria, who want to come on missions and involve themselves with these groups, learn about them, educate people back home, are in danger of A, being sanctioned, B, having all of their plans disrupted by absolutely unpredictable sanctions that is very hard to comply in advance with. So it violates the First Amendment rights of Americans to engage in speech alongside with and on behalf of people in Judea and Samaria. It also, of course, violates the Equal Protection Clause, because manifestly only Jews have been sanctioned, despite clearly Palestinian violence being orders of magnitude greater, and also there being sort of clear, proven in court beyond a doubt cases of Palestinian violence where no sanctions are issued. And I think the clearest example, in the case of Palestinian violence, Congress has made the determination that the pay-for-slave program of the Palestinian Authority is itself murder for hire.
Right.
So that means every time they send a check to a arrested terrorist, the Palestinian government is promoting violence in the West Bank. Not a single Palestinian official has been sanctioned. And we know that some of the part of the administration's tactics in these sanctions is to take a large organization, allege that one or two members of it engaged in some kind of act of property destruction, and then sanction the entire organization. By this standard, just to be clear, Black Lives Matter wouldn't be non-existent anymore, would be under sanctions. Students for Justice of Palestine would be sanctioned. But consider this. Fatah police officers have been involved in terrorist attacks. There was a terror attack just this week. 3 policemen were killed by a former member of
the Presidential Guard.
The Presidential Guard of a boss who I assume is also a Fatah member.
And by the way, they claimed, the Palestinian Authority said, oh, well, he left 9 years ago. But there's evidence from their own postings that that's not true. And more than that, Lieutenant General Mike Fenzel, who is one of the key nodes in the sanctions machines of Israelis, his operation trains the Palestinian Presidential Guard and arms them, and they're paid for by U.S. taxpayers. So the United States is actually funding these organizations that are engaged, whose personnel are engaged in acts of deliberate terrorist murder of Israelis. And then the same Lieutenant General, Mike Fenzel, is playing an instrumental role in sanctioning Israeli citizens for non-criminal, non-violent activities in pursuit of protecting Jewish lives in Judea and Samaria and throughout the country, which is what Tzav Tesha was also trying to do. Tzav 9 is also trying to do by blocking material support from going to Hamas in the middle of a war.
So no wonder he's not sanctioning the Palestinian officials. But I should say, even if this guy's not a member of the Presidential Guard, I assume he's a member of Fatah.
The two car bombers at Gush Etzion that took place Friday night, I talked about it on the last In Focus, they were members of Fatah.
And Fatah, as they say, claimed credit, which I would call admitted guilt.
Right, and they also, I think they also claim credit for the failed suicide bombing in Tel Aviv that took place a couple of weeks ago.
So by the way these sanctions are administered, that should mean the leaders of Fatah,
which is
should have
Mahmoud Abbas,
and all his subordinates should have their bank accounts frozen. But of course, that's not what this is about.
That is the Equal Protection Clause.
So that's an Equal Protection Clause.
So you filed this in a federal court in Texas?
I'm an advisor to a team of very distinguished lawyers, including the former Solicitor General of Texas and Mark Zell,
Professor Avi Bell,
Jerome Marcus, Nat Lewin, working with the firm of Holtzman Vogel, a really great team who are representing these plaintiffs. There are more cases, I think, that can be brought as the sanctions continue to expand and as they continue to chill speech by Americans. That is, let me say, the ultimate goal here is to imagine what's going to happen. If this is what's happened in election season, imagine what's going to happen after November. Regardless of who wins, and I think after January,
if Harrison state sanctions against Israel, I think is
absolutely
how you can look at it.
By now,
because they already tried to sanction a unit of the IDF, right?
So that under a different legal authority under the Leahy Act, but clearly, and there's been a lot of talk by the Biden administration of sanctioning Israeli cabinet ministers, and in Israel, there's Jewish...
And also Kamala was talking about an arms embargo.
There's Jewish geography. Everyone's related by 1 degree. So because of the way sanctions work, if you're related by 1 degree, if you have a connection, you can be sanctioned. So, for example, the organization sanctioned last week, Hashomer Yosh, it's gotten support from Israel...
Samaria guardsmen, basically.
Yeah, volunteer guardsmen. It's gotten support from various Israeli governmental organizations. Now they can sanction the Israeli government. The idea is... So the BDS movement has been going on for a couple decades, and it's been quite unsuccessful. I've been fighting it, I think, and with many allies, quite successfully.
Well, that's another show. We'll do another show on what you did with BDS.
The BDS, the boycott divestment, is getting companies to boycott. Companies don't want to boycott because they don't really have a political agenda. They can be sort of bullied or intimidated, but really they're not interested in that. And so it's been a colossal failure. They couldn't even get Ben and Jerry's to maintain a boycott. So they've skipped the B and the D, and they've gone straight to the S. And again, this is not about violent settlers. You don't need to be violent. You don't need to be a settler. There was an accusation of a Muslim ban by the Trump administration. This is the beginning of a Jew ban. And also sanctions mean your entry to the U.S. is denied. That's another consequence. They are looking essentially to...
they went after Elor Azaria, who was tried, convicted, spent time in prison back in 2018. They just sanctioned him. He owns a bakery in Ramla. For no reason. It's just to be mean.
What makes the Elor Azaria case important, he was a soldier who, in the course of his military service, shot a terrorist. Now, he was tried for that because it was deemed a wrongful shooting, improper use of force, and he spent time in jail in Israel. But if you can sanction soldiers for things they did as part of their military service, then you can then every soldier now
in Gaza
is gonna have to think twice, not take a shot that maybe they should take and endanger Israeli lives.
By the way, there was a story that came out. Itamar Eichner wrote it up in Yediot Achronot about a month and a half ago. I did a show where I talked about it, that Israeli soldiers reservists who served in Gaza, then wanted to go abroad to, clear their heads, to take a break when they get released from combat, they've been denied visas into the United States. So they go into U.S. consulates
and interrogated about whether they committed war crimes.
Interrogated for hours about what they did specifically, what units they were in, what firearms they used, what acts of war they engaged in during active combat activities in Gaza against Hamas. And so these young people are in total shock. And I talked about this with Professor Bell, and he was explaining to me, look, nothing happens, but then you have a data bank. And you end up with all of this information. It's in the system. And so, like you said, come November 6th, the day after the election, win or lose, right? They have 2 months to do whatever they want.
And if they win, they have 4 years. And, they're adding to the sanctions list every month. I have to say, it is one of the least appreciated but most insidious and dangerous actions the Biden administration has taken against Israel since the start of the war. And it's tight. There's a lot of competition in that category. I have to say the reaction of the Jewish community in America to this has been a bit lackluster, or entirely lackluster. They have not protested it in any way. I think too many of them maybe are willing to believe this violent settler stereotype, even though whether it's true or not actually has nothing to do with this executive order, which is, again, not limited to violence and not limited to settlers. And that's what makes, I think, this lawsuit so important.
Right. So what can the lawsuit, first of all, what are you suing? You're suing that it's a violation of civil rights? Is that?
Yeah, so it's a series of constitutional violations are claimed by the various
And what
plaintiffs.
happens if you win?
Presumably there would be an injunction against the use of this executive order in some way. What the shape of that injunction?
Can that happen? I mean, can a judge block an executive? I don't understand the law.
That was the entire Muslim ban litigation was against an executive order.
So that this potentially could stop the program? Would it end the sanctions that have already been placed on Israelis?
So none of our plaintiffs are people who have actually been sanctioned themselves. I think it could narrow or force an alteration in the program by itself. But there are more lawsuits to be brought. The scope of these sanctions seem to get broader and more aggressive as they go on, and it's I think a crucial issue and a real sign of how this administration has demoted Israel as a result of Israel defending itself from Hamas.
I don't know if it's as a result or if it just happens to be an opportunity. Whatever the case may be, I mean, we could go on and talk about this, and maybe we should, but there are a lot of other subjects that I want to touch on. And one of them, I said we're going to talk about the Kohelet, your affiliation with Kohelet, which is a policy think tank that I've worked with over the years, and they're one of the most important, just so you guys know, they're one of the most important policy think tanks in Israel. And we've talked about what happened to Kohelet over the past 2 years with the anti-government protesters, and I want to talk about it with you. I've spoken about it with your boss, with Moshe Capel. Professor Capel was also on the show talking about it. But let's just summarize briefly the incredible, very similar campaign, although from a domestic perspective, to criminalize or to delegitimize, to render radioactive one of the most important generators of policy ideas in Israel, that is the Kohelet policy forum. What just give me in brief summary. Frequent viewers already know, but let's review.
Sure. I think it is it's an issue. It's an issue which segues nicely from the sanctions issue.
Exactly.
Because when we hear discussions of what supposedly fascist right-wing authoritarian countries like Hungary do, one of the key aspects of authoritarian fascist states is shutting down civil society. When Israel, passed laws even to try to get foreign-funded NGOs,
foreign government
funded, agents of foreign governments, to disclose their status as being funded by foreign governments, it was called authoritarian, an attempt to silence civil society.
I remember.
But the sanctions that the United States is imposing is amongst other things on civil society groups like Tzab 9, NGOs.
Well, I mean, the Shomer Yosh. All they do is protect farmland.
Volunteer civil society organizations. And so one thing we see is there's this weird, I wouldn't even say double standard, but alternate reality in which progressive forces engage in the same kind of activity that they denounce, but on steroids, but for real. That is to say, they are trying to close down civil society organizations. And the campaign against Kohelet, I think, is a leading example of the efforts of the progressive forces to take their opposition off the map. Right. Not just win policy arguments,
but
make
them.
Sure there won't be more people, there won't be policy arguments in the future because there'll be nobody arguing the other side.
Right. There's no civil society on the other side because they're all under American sanctions, everybody, or intimidated by American sanctions, so they're all going to be quiet. And they're not going to have anybody helping them put together alternative policies because they're all going to be delegitimized as enemies of the people or whatever. So that's so let's go into what happened.
Kohelet is a think tank in Israel that deals, it's about 11, 12 years old, and it deals with a wide range of issues. Probably most of its efforts are spent on economic deregulation, lowering the cost of living for Israelis, reducing tariffs, monopoly issues, what you'd call general economic libertarian policies. Also, Kohelet very strongly believes in democracy in the Jewish state, and democracy means policy decision-making power is in the hands of elected officials, as opposed to unelected bureaucrats. And as a result, Kohelet supported reforms to the legal system because of the vast power that unelected officials have, not just judges, also legal advisors, the Attorney General. That's actually one of the major parts of the story. And because of Kohelet's support for legal reforms, it was a campaign of demonization was run against it, which led to direct, I would call, violence. Our offices were broken into twice by Ahim Leneshek, the leading protest group. And it's,
which, as I talked about with you guys, it works out that they've been fundraising, over 140 million shekels, and they've spent like 45 million, almost all of it on PR. And, they were supposed to be doing all of this relief work. They got massive amounts of money from the Jewish federations of North America and other major American Jewish organizations, thinking that they're giving money to the evacuees from the north, from the south, to the to IDF reservists, etc. No, the things that we're seeing now, the funding, the mass protests that we're seeing on the streets, that's Achim Leneshek. That's brothers in arms, and they were the ones behind tearing apart the IDF before October 7th, saying we're not gonna, we're pilots, we're special operations soldiers, we're this, we're that, we're not gonna serve, we're signals intelligence officers in the intelligence corps, we're not gonna serve in reserves because we oppose judicial reform in Israel. So this goon squad that was tearing apart every strategically significant institution in Israel just singled out Kohelet and started barricading your offices,
harassing our staff,
demonstrations outside your home, going to you when you're sitting at dinner with your families,
and
assaulting.
Also quite significant in the United States.
Going after your donors.
People affiliated harassed our donors and camped out in front of their houses, and that led some of these donors to withdraw their support, and that was a significant blow. But we are not going to be silenced, and we are not going to stop, and we're not going to be intimidated, and we're not going to let this take us off the board. We have now turned to the public in a crowdfunding campaign, which has had really significant success. Thousands and thousands of Israelis from all walks of life have volunteered varying sums because they appreciate the importance of the work we do. Really, this issue, our situation, is kind of similar to what's going on in the United States in many ways. That is to say, there's a lot of parallels between prosecution of political figures in the United States, the power of the bureaucracy, sometimes called the deep state. The difference is, in America, there's a wide range of civil society organizations and think tanks to counter that, because America's been around for a long time and there's been time for it to develop. You have institutions like the Heritage Foundation, AEI, Cato. There's just such a wide range of think tanks to generate policy ideas.
And obviously there are parallels on the left. And you have them not only on the federal level,
right.
you have them in individual
Brookings,
states.
every state has a
I
think tank.
remember I was in Austin this spring, and I had the opportunity to do a tour. I think it's called the Texas Policy Center or something. Yes. They have this beautiful building. It's right across from the Capitol.
And their goal is to be outside the government generators of ideas on both sides. Now, in Israel, there are prominent institutions like this on the left, but because it's a newer country, there is no general broad policy institute other than Kohelet. So, we're kind of like Heritage, AEI, Cato, all combined. So they understand that by taking us out, they will intellectually cripple policy making by the right, and that's why we're not going to let it happen.
Yeah, but that is why you were targeted, and
Indeed.
and demonized, and as a friend of Kohelet, it was appalling to watch, and that really brings us to the issue of the ICC and the way that the army lawyers, our bureaucracy, our inbred democracy of the legal system, is dealing with the International Criminal Court, because Kohelet and most people with a modicum of common sense would look at Karim Khan, I think his name, right? The prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, who's put out these specious claims against Prime Minister Netanyahu and Defense Minister Gantz, saying that they're deliberately starving Gazans, when the UN, his own go-to group, right? They said nobody's being starved in Gaza, right? And the calorie count is fine and everything's great. No. He wants to issue international arrest warrants, and then you have the progressive government in Britain saying we'll honor them and all this other stuff. So you have him saying, criminal charges against war crimes charges against Netanyahu and Gallant, and this is obviously a political act. And our legal fraternity, the people who desperately need to have their wings clipped, are saying, well, now you see why we're important. We're important because what we're going to do is we're going to open up specious war crimes investigations against Israel's heroes, against our warfighters, including people who left their homes on their own without being called on October 7th and went to the overrun communities across the border from Gaza to save lives of people who were being burned to death, etc. And so they're opening up these investigations of Israeli reservists, Israeli Israeli soldiers for incredible allegations of mistreatment of Hamas terrorists. And they're saying this is how we're going to protect Israel from the ICC. We're going to prove that we're going after all allegations of war crimes. But what they're doing is they're saying to the world, look, we have war criminals. You're right to come after us, because this isn't about the law. It's entirely a political warfare campaign against Israel. So, I believe we have war crimes investigations against our fighters, and then we have this morning I was just reading again, Attorney General Gali Barav Miara, a woman who is a complete imbecile with everything having to do with actual international law, saying, the way to protect the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister and the IDF and everybody else from International Criminal Court allegations is by opening up a commission of inquiry into October 7th, and my friends will chair it, and we're going to show them that we're going to go after all the riffraff. And what do you make of this?
So I think
now that I've given the whole thing,
I think some Israeli bureaucrats, again, for people who aren't familiar with this, the Attorney General is not like in America, picked by the president and fireable by the president.
To the contrary.
This Attorney General was not picked by this government and is, for all intents and purposes, completely not fireable. Also, crucial to know, and this was at the center of the reasonableness debate, the debate about the Supreme Court reasonableness doctrine. In America, the Attorney General provides advice to the president, and he can listen or not listen. For example, President Biden was advised by his Attorney General that the student loan elimination that he did would not be approved by the Supreme Court. So he called a different lawyer, Lawrence Tribe at Harvard, who told him it would be okay, and so he did it. In Israel, you can't do that. The government is bound by the Attorney General, not the Attorney General bound by the government. So these officials now are, I think, quite cynically using the ICC, which they would say, which Israel considers illegitimate, which Israel has not agreed to.
Which we're not a member, we're not a signatory of the World Cup Statute.
And what I'm about to say, I think every Israeli politician would agree to. This is not a left-right thing. Every Israeli politician says the ICC has no legitimacy, we're not members, and they have absolutely no authority. Nonetheless, the politicized threat of prosecution is being used by some members of the Israeli legal establishment to enhance their own, to say basically we should have more power. Here's a crucial thing. the ICC has no jurisdiction over Israel. That's the position of the Israeli government. Once you take that position, doing things to avert ICC prosecution implicitly gives them power. If you do anything because of the ICC domestically, you're empowering the ICC. And when you read what the ICC says, they say, here's a crucial thing. ICC has no power on its own. They have never successfully gone after a sitting head of state, a sitting leader. The only way they can actually get people is by having the country cooperate.
Okay.
And they look to see whether the country is cooperating. And when a country begins doing things like what the Attorney General is proposing, the ICC takes it as a win. They say, look, this shows we have clout, right? They need someone on the inside to be effective. And unfortunately, the Attorney General is offering to be that person on the inside. And what's, I think, worse about, so first of all, it legitimizes the ICC and undermines the government's position that the ICC has no authority. If it has no authority,
then leave it alone.
Then leave it alone. We're not going to, let's say that Iran, indicts Benjamin Netanyahu. We're not going to have a commission of inquiry to make sure Iran doesn't convict Benjamin Netanyahu. Exactly the same thing. The United States didn't open a commission of inquiry when the ICC was investigating U.S. officials. The opposite. They actually imposed sanctions on ICC officials, which President Biden later abandoned. But worse, it's futile.
We should be doing that too. Why aren't we sanctioning these people?
We have less to sanction with, but
it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
The point
is important. But also, it's futile. That is to say, the problem the ICC has is they believe that we have committed crimes which we do not believe either are crimes or have even happened. You can't indict someone for something that, hasn't actually happened. And they won't listen anyway. Whatever this committee of inquiry does, either it is pressured politically into convicting officials to appease the ICC, in which case it has politically fed the monster and committed an injustice, or if they acquit, it will never be good enough for the ICC. How do we know? But I want to remind people, during the judicial reform battle, one of the arguments against the reform was that Israel's legal system is an iron dome against The Hague.
Against the ICC and the ICJ,
and the ICJ,
we'll get to in a second.
Both of which, immediately after, not only did the judicial reform not succeed, the court took more power by declaring it has the power to overturn even constitutional amendments. To its power. So now the court is actually more powerful than it was during the judicial reform debate. Nonetheless, ICJ and ICC are going after Israel as it fights a war for its basic defense over policies which in Israel are fundamentally uncontroversial. This is not about the settlements. This is about the war in Gaza. So
it's better soldiers.
It's about they're calling our self-defense genocide. Yeah. So it's not. But now they're saying, you know what? It wasn't an iron dome because maybe we need even more power for the judicial system. At some point, the argument has to be seen to have been a failure. But this committee, not doing anything because of the ICC or ICJ, taking any domestic action, encourages them, fuels their prosecution, gives them legitimacy that they do. I would actually say to join the ICC, a country has to join the ICC. Right. That's a political decision because you are giving authority to this foreign, unaccountable body. Israel, like America, has not made that decision. So anything the bureaucracy does to give even a shadow of power to the ICC fundamentally goes against the basic need to have the political action, democratic action, to give power to such bodies. And of course, it's going to be completely futile.
Thus proving the point that Israel desperately needs legal reform and that Kohelet was being hounded by the left because it was doing the right thing. Because that
I'd rather it not be proven in such a tragic way.
Well, it's not just, unfortunately, all of us are proven correct day in and day out in multiple arenas. And let's just go, because we have to put a cherry on top, to the ICJ, to the International Court of Justice, or injustice, as the case may be, that's trying Israel for genocide. And, it's one of those things. We had a one-day genocide enacted against the Jewish people, and then within 2 months, we find ourselves being accused of genocide in this kangaroo courtroom. Do you think Israel was right to defend itself there, or should we have just taken action in the Knesset to amend our recognition or whatever acceptance of the Genocide Convention and deny the International Court of Justice any jurisdiction over Israel on this issue and then just walk away?
So a bit of both. So the ICJ proceedings, perverted and gross as they are on a somewhat different footing from the ICC. ICC, Israel has not joined, it has no authority. ICJ has jurisdiction over, they don't have sort of a global jurisdiction. Rather, they can hear disputes when a country agrees in a treaty. The disputes under that treaty will be heard by the...
Right, which is the Genocide Convention that Israel innocently signed on to. Right?
Israel, the Genocide Convention, written after the Holocaust to prevent another Holocaust. Now, the way the ICJ has taken jurisdiction under the Genocide Convention is quite dodgy. That is to say, the Genocide Convention says the ICJ can hear disputes concerning the application of the treaty, meaning what it has historically meant is two countries are having a war and they accuse each other of genocide. Croatia, Serbia, Russia, Ukraine. In this case, South Africa wrote a letter to Israel saying, you guys are committing genocide. Israel wrote a letter back, no, we are not. We have a dispute, South Africa said. So South Africa has nothing to do with this dispute. So it's a little bit dodgy, but Israel has in fact signed the Genocide Convention, giving ICJ jurisdiction of some kind over issues related to it. And in retrospect, that was a mistake. And it was not a necessary mistake. The United States...
did not give jurisdiction to them.
Did not. Now, is that because the United States is out to commit genocide? No. It's because the United States understands that a tribunal like this could be biased, partial, unaccountable, and, in this case, run by a Lebanese official. Official that does not even recognize the existence of a state of Israel. So we need to correct that mistake. It's not clear that it won't have an effect on the current case, but unless we change our acceptance of ICJ jurisdiction under the Genocide Convention, every war Israel will have. During the war, the government's thinking is obviously about current crises, but we can look down the road, right? In a sense, I would say the ICJ proceedings were kind of like a legal October 7th. We could have seen that it was going to happen. Right? We should have been wary of this tribunal in the way the United States was. But now, certainly, there's no excuse to give them jurisdiction going forward, because imagine a war in Lebanon. Again, genocide accusations.
It's not imagine. We're planning one.
There's going to be a war with Lebanon. There will be accusations of genocide. And do we want that to be micromanaged by Lebanese bureaucrats in The Hague?
Or even our IDF lawyers who manifestly don't understand or are self-serving and use the terminology of lawfare in order to expand their own powers.
And I think the government is worried that if we, change our acceptance of ICJ jurisdiction, people will say,
see, you're trying to hide.
See, you're trying to hide it. But we have, I think, an excellent president. The United States, and again, many other countries are in exactly the same position. We even waited for them to abuse this jurisdiction. But at some point, obviously the news cycle in which Israel says we're not going to have ICJ jurisdiction over this going forward is going to be a bad one. But the alternative
is worse.
The alternative is every single war is going to be a long ICJ genocide investigation.
We should start winding down, and yep. I would love to tell you, well, what are we supposed to do? It's not even just that. In a way, I've had 2 or 3 shows with Professor Bell, I think since October 7th, about issues like this, including the ICJ. And it's a little bit irritating that in the middle of a war for Israel's survival, where we're being attacked from 7 fronts by Iran and its proxies, who are all declared, have all declared their absolute commitment to the annihilation of the Jewish people and the Jewish state, that's their purpose in fighting us, that I keep having to interview lawyers to make the case that Israel isn't a war criminal, that we're not a Nazi state. I mean, it seems so stupid, and yet it seems like it just keeps getting worse. So the question is, like, sort of the last question as we wind down, I'm not going to say what specifically does Israel have to do, but what are a couple of general principles that should be directing our understanding of what's happening so that we could at least base policies on those general principles and not hurt ourselves more?
Yeah, so partly, I think Israel is a soft target because it doesn't fight back, as it were, right? So you know that the ICC knows if it goes after Russian officials, it's going to be in trouble with Russia, and if it goes after American officials, it's going to be in trouble with America, right? That was the Trump sanctions. Israel never pushes back. Israel never takes measures, right? So, for example, Israel hasn't said no ICC staff can come to Israel again. We need to be pushing back. Part of it is they believe that they have enablers within Israel that will help them effectuate these things. And I think, for October 7th, I think for the whole country was a wake-up call. And one of the many things that was a wake-up call about was, the international institutions originally created for good things 80 years ago have become captive and fundamentally enthralled to horribly anti-Semitic agendas. And we saw this in the Secretary General of the United Nations, saw this in many UN agencies. And for many, that was a fundamentally disillusioning thing with international institutions. So a lot of people in Israel want to believe in the efficacy of these international institutions, right? They're designed to do good things, and they want to have some hope for them. October 7th, I think, broke those dreams. But what has surprised me was how quickly people have reverted to the. We can't get rid of UNRWA because, it's part of the UN. They're supposed to do something good, so that presumably that good thing could never be done by anybody else. And I think because there's a certain worldview, a Whiggish progressive worldview, that these international organizations are going to bring countries ever closer, are going to erode sort of national barriers, and everyone's going to come together, kumbaya, in a rules-based world order, as they call it, and sing John Lennon's song, Imagine. This is a kind of eschatological belief, right? It is a belief about sort of progress leading to a culmination of a kind of golden era.
The arc of history bends towards justice.
Yeah, so I think, we have seen the arc of history. I would paraphrase Barack Obama's favorite Martin Luther King quote to say, the arc of history is long and bends towards blood libels. Right? We didn't need the Enlightenment for what we're seeing from Europe now. We could have just skipped straight from the Middle Ages. But for many, that disillusionment is very heavy because they don't have
well, that's what we're working towards is the other thing.
They don't have an alternative hope.
Right.
That is to say, they're skeptical of nationalism, they're skeptical of ethnic claims, religious claims. So this is a kind of secular religion. And, your Messiah betraying you, for some people is a revelatory moment. And for others is a temporary revelation after which, you rejoin.
It was a hiccup.
It was he's just delayed or got lost. So I think it's important to, really let it again, for me, it was, I'm pretty cynical about these institutions. I was amazed, stunned, horrified, betrayed by the complete depth of their repugnant behavior after October 7th, their moral equivalence, and so forth. But that requires an attitude change for water, a fundamental attitude change, right? And I think that attitude change is hard to really sink in.
All right. Well, I think you're right. It all starts with our willingness to countenance difficult realities. And I thank you very much for going through a lot of those realities with me today. Obviously, we only touched the surface of some of these issues that they all deserve in-depth discussions just of themselves. But hopefully we've added a little bit of light to the darkness that is the lawfare campaign being waged against Israel across so many different fronts and in so many different ways with so many different innocent victims in Israel. So hopefully that'll move forward with that change in mentality so people can understand things. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me today for this program. We'll have to have you back. And thank you guys for listening, and we'll have more next week. Don't worry, we're not going anywhere. Take care.
Thank you, Caroline.
All right.